Hi everyone! This week we are going to finish the first part of the second unbundling. In particular, I will talk about bilateral investment treaties and their evolution since the beginning of 1990s. And then I will move on to the second part of the second unbundling and look at the different changes on the economic aggregates, and also on the structure of industries between the north and the south. Picking up where we left off last week, we were talking about bilateral investment treaties. This sounds a bit like a regional trade agreement, except that here we are not talking about agreements on tariffs and just about talking about trade. Rather, we talk about conditions around conditions to facilitate trade. So it's not just about the price of making of trade by playing with export subsidies and import tariffs. Rather, here we talk about an agreement between, well, two countries, bilateral or multilateral for multiple countries, regarding the promotion, the protection, and the liberalization of investments made by investors from respective countries in each other's territory. The idea is to provide a number of guarantees, such as fair and equitable treatment, protection from expropriation, free transfers of means, and so on. So the idea is that two countries might be interested in investing in each other, or at least firms of each country might want to invest in firms in the other country. So firms can make an agreement and sign a bilateral investment treaty in order to promote those investments and to protect from potential caveats and pernicious consequences. So for instance, if a country or if a firm from one country wants to invest in another country, these firms might want to get guarantees about the protection of its innovations, let's say, things about patents and things like that, which are regulated at the national level, but not at the international level. So they want to make sure that they will be protected if things like that happen, in order for them to invest massive amounts of money abroad. A controversial aspect is that they typically allow for a separate dispute resolution mechanism, whereby an investor whose rights under the BIT might have been violated has recourse to binding international rather than suing the host state in its own courts. So, one of the criticisms of bilateral investment treaties is that to settle conflicts, those countries usually go through some binding international agreement rather than using their own national laws. So this has led to greater liability and uncertain net gains from BITs, especially for less developed countries. Okay, so let's look at those BATs being signed over time, and in particular you can see that after 1987, rather beginning in the 1990s, the number of BITs increased a lot. In fact, you can recognize again some exponential curve due to the decrease in communication costs. So it's not just about being able to sell your goods abroad, now it's being able to safely transfer some of your knowledge to another country without the fear of being copied, being spied by other companies, and having the fear of having your knowledge or your know-how being stolen by other companies. You can see that the number of foreign direct investments also increased in a very similar fashion. I'm not sure about the trough here at the end of the 1990s. That could be the internet bubble at the beginning of the 2000s that probably limited the FDIs from the north to the south. But you can see that the pattern follows the number of BITs being signed. So basically firms who knew that they would be protected when they transfer their know-how to the south, where labor would be cheaper, then they knew they could invest in those countries with a lower risk. Remember, FDI, foreign direct investments. Could be, for instance, a Canadian company decided to invest some money abroad to maybe, so we saw 4 different types of FDI. We saw the vertical ones, horizontal ones, brownfield ones, and greenfield ones. Depending on the nature of the investment, do you invest in firms which are higher up in the supply chain? That would be vertical. Do you invest in firms which are pretty much doing the same business as you? That would be horizontal. Do you invest in a brand new plant? Do you just build a brand new capacity abroad? That would be greenfield. Or do you invest in an existing capacity for your own production? That would be a brownfield investment. At the same time, you can check the evolution of tariffs. Again, tariffs decreased overall pretty much everywhere. In particular, in what we call the South, as opposed to the North, where they were already small due to the first unbundling. We saw during the first unbundling, in particular between 1950 and 1990, after both world wars, that tariffs decreased a lot due to many GATT rounds, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So we already knew that the North was doing trade. Northern countries were doing trade with each other with very low tariffs. However, since the 1990s, because of the second unbundling, because of the decrease in communication costs, then the South also decreased its tariffs to facilitate trade. So tariffs in the South were high before the 1990s, 1995 pretty much. After that, developing nations unilaterally lowered tariffs massively. So what used to be protectionism now becomes destructionism. So what we mean by destructionism we mean a destruction of borders in the sense of trade borders. Okay? We do not want to protect ourselves from foreign countries. Rather, we welcome them because it's going to be good for our country's business. Note that here I talk about 1995. In the previous slide, I talked about 1987. Overall, what I mean is 1990s. Beginning of 1990s, a bit before, a bit after, is where the second unbundling happens. So don't worry about precisely talking about 1995 for the lower tariffs. I could go to 1990 here, rather, and I could also argue that there is a decrease of tariffs, at least in South Asia, even though not so much in East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Middle East and North Africa. You need to know overall around when this second unbundling happened. And this didn't even happen due to World Trade Organization or GATT rounds. It's literally just countries unilaterally deciding to lower the tariffs. So let's go over Latin America and East Asia. So you can see a bunch of countries: AR for Argentina, BO for Bolivia, BR for Brazil, CH for Chile, CO for Colombia, and so on. All of them decreased pretty much at the same time, and they became very, very flat, around 10% for an average. Yes, second unbundling starts in 1990. Remember the main graph of the course, which is great stagnation until 1820, great divergence until 1990, and from 1990 to today, we have the great convergence back. You need to remember those dates for for the rest of the course. So tariffs in the south decrease because of the lower communication costs. Now northern firms can transfer their know-how to those countries. Those countries have low wages, and since now they can also benefit from the know-how, northern firms can become more competitive due to lower wages. And so the idea is that those south countries now will become the new factories of the world. So in order for them to sell the goods they produce abroad, they will need to reduce their tariffs. That's the idea. And in East Asia, we see pretty much the same pattern. It's not exactly the same everywhere. That could be due to political fluctuations as well. But overall, tariffs decreased, and by the beginning of the 2000s, tariffs were between 15 and let's say 5%. And pretty much the same as Latin America, where they are between, there was a country or two like Mexico or Argentina, which is close to 20, but overall, most countries in Latin America are around 10%. The number of RTA also increased due to the second unbundling. And again, we see another exponential increase in RTAs. So not only BITs increased, but also FDI and RTAs. So the second unbundling boosted the increase in RTAs, the decrease in tariffs, and the increase in foreign direct investments. I'm going to talk about deep provisions in a minute. So, starting in 1990, most RTAs were what we call shallow. So it's really just about tariffs. Oh, decrease your tariff on steel, decrease your tariff on corn, on wheat, and so on. Just so that firms could exploit their comparative advantage and could sell their goods abroad. You can see though here that in 1990, the exponential increase is in what we call deep provisions. More rather than just number of RTAs. So most RTAs which are about tariffs are called shallow, but deep provisions RTAs are going to be bundles of more of other conditions than just tariffs. So let's go over deep versus shallow trade agreements. Deep trade agreements include a wide range of issues beyond tariffs, such as services, investments, intellectual property protection, and competition policy. These policy areas involve domestic regulations, but these effects are harder to assess than just border agreements, such as lower tariffs. When we look at lower tariffs, we see directly their impact through trade creation and trade diversion. We see which country starts to export and import more as opposed to another country after change in tariffs. Now, between countries, because countries might have different agreements on different conditions around trade, such as investments, intellectual property, competition policies, and so on, the effects are harder to assess, and it is harder to identify the let's say the increase in exports. It is harder to tell whether an increase in exports comes from lower tariffs, better intellectual property protection, or better investments, and so on. So this deep integration, those deep agreement conditions occur because when trade becomes more open, countries' policies increasingly depend on each other. Simply put, it's not just about tariffs anymore. If you want to facilitate trade even more, this is also going to depend on what respective governments, where respective governments stand in terms of trade policy. Deep integration agreements may be necessary to promote trade in certain sectors and economic integration more broadly. This applies to international production networks, which require a governance structure beyond low tariffs. Think about, in particular, sectors where know-how is very important, very detailed, very precise, and that requires maybe huge investments. So think about the high-tech industry. If you want to produce the latest technology in terms of, let's say, phones, computers, and so on, you might need to, as a firm, you might need to invest in research and development a lot. But this investment is very high and is made ex ante. Nothing says that you are going to find something at the end. Nothing says that after spending billions of dollars into some research, into some engineering and so on, nothing tells you that you will get to something that is very innovative. You might just be able to produce something slightly more innovative than the competition, which might not be enough to offset, to compensate or to pay for this huge investment. Because innovation is costly and risky, or rather, because research and development is costly and risky, firms might need some guarantees that they, one way or another, the consequence of the research, the results of the research, will be protected one way or another. If they decide to sell a new phone to a country that doesn't give a hoot about intellectual property, firms from that country might just buy one of these phones, might just cut it open, pick it apart, and start to imitate this technology without any cost. Of course, that would result in a huge loss for the company that came up with the innovation in the first place. Yeah, it sounds familiar. Many countries do that, whether it's legal or not. And in some countries, it's actually a cultural thing to imitate competitors which are successful. It's almost a sign of respect. I am imitating you because I know that what you're doing works. But if this results in more competition, that might be harmful to the first firm who paid a huge amount of money to come up with this innovation in the first place. So among deep trade agreement provisions, we can find a bunch of these conditions. Some of them are about customs, state aid, so that would be assessment of anti-competitive behavior. So there will be a report on how anti-competitive a country could behave with respect to a foreign good. There could be general agreement on trade in services, which is a bit more precise than just goods in general. That could be regarding investments or capital movements. So those could be extra conditions that may make trade between firms or may make investments between a firm from one country to another country easier, and as a result, trade might also be easier. The idea, think about a southern country in the 1990s. They are not producing the goods yet. The North is still on it. But now that know-how can be transferred to the South, southern country might decide, hey, come here. We are cheap. We are still developing. So we have low wages. You can come with your own knowledge. We're going to learn from you. And we're going to provide you low wages. So you're going to become more competitive. Those countries, those governments can then propose bilateral investment treaties and deep trade and make deep trade agreements to facilitate investments by the North to the South. So, summary. After the 1990s, 1990s is pretty much when people started talking about globalization. Globalization as we know it today, when people say, oh, it's a globalized world, we are still in globalization, technically, This is very old. This dates back to the 1820s with the first unbundling. Now that there is a decrease in communication costs, people are more involved in the globalization process. In particular, with the first unbundling, mostly firms were the ones traveling abroad to trade their goods. You could get goods from other countries, but you would not be in contact with the other countries. You would have to rely on those firms, bringing goods from other countries. With the second unbundling, now we get in touch with anybody in the world as long as there is a decent internet connection, right? So now globalization is on everybody's lips because everybody is in it. But it's not that new. So G7 nations deindustrialized while a handful of developing nations industrialize. Why a handful? Well, because not all the developing nations got on board with the globalization boat. Some of them proposed more agreements to facilitate investments from the north to the south. The effects are concentrated geographically for that reason. And rapidly industrializing nations experience steep growth takeoffs. Some of them experience growth with two digits. Northern countries never experience two-digit growth. In fact, if you ask the French government what a good growth would be, they would tell you that would be great if we had 3%. In the developing world, it is not unusual to see stuff like minimum 5%, 8%, sometimes 10%. Not so much anymore, especially with the pandemic, but 10 years ago, that was not surprising at all. So the soaring income growth in those countries set off a commodity supercycle. Again, a sharp increase in demand for those goods now that there is a whole new demand that was created due to the income growth. So there's a rapid growth in developing nation and a rather stagnating growth in G7 nation. And this is what produced the Great Convergence, where the North took off during the first unbundling because they had the know-how and they were pretty much the factories of the world. Now that the factories of the world are in the South, the G7 countries did not grow as much, although they became more competitive. Rather, the developing countries developed way faster, and so they started converging towards G7 nations. This is the end of the graph that I've been talking about so far. And the nature of trade between G7 countries and many developing nations changed dramatically, and that will be what I'm going to talk about today in part 2. Almost all developing nations massively liberalized their policies on trade in order to facilitate investments. Capital, services, intellectual property, whatever makes investments coming from the north easier. This is the graph I was talking about. As manufacturing now concentrates in developing nations, China and India being two of the biggest recipients of these FDI coming from the north, then their share of world GDP increased again, while at the same time, since most of this production doesn't take place in G7 countries anymore, the G7 share of world GDP decreased. But that's not all, and this is what part 2 will be about. Now, I want to quickly talk about the midterm. I see some questions in the chat about the midterm. Everything is in the announcement. You don't need to know anything else. There is no practice exam. This is the first time I'm teaching this class, so there won't be any practice exam. Just know that the multiple choice will look like what you've done in quizzes, and The short answer problems will ask you to either define some concepts seen in class and maybe use them to build some arguments, or it could be small exercises. If there is some math, you won't need any calculator. It will be very, very basic math. Okay? This week's content will also be covered. Check my announcement. Okay. So now let's get into part 2 of the second unbundling. Any questions about part 1 before I start part 2? Don't worry about the math. It will be just, if there is math, it will be just very easy numbers like make fractions or things like that. I don't know yet. I haven't finished making the exam yet, but I'm thinking about giving you maybe a question or two, very little math, just for you to apply the notions seen in class. Okay? You won't need the calculators, but if you want to have one with you, sure. If you're stressed about it, take a calculator with you. That won't change anything. Okay? Any other questions? Know that economics, at least as it is taught today in university, involves a substantial amount of math. It's a first year course, so of course you won't have a lot of calculus to do and things like that. But just so you know, at the master's level or at the PhD level, the math that economists do is coming from the math that engineers were doing in the 50s and beginning 40s when they were working on launching rockets to Russia. So some of this math is coming from physics and now is being applied to economic theory. Of course, I'm talking about the master's and PhD levels, which is a couple of steps ahead of what you will see in your bachelor's program. But if you want to pursue economics at university, you will have to take some calculus courses. Just to give you an idea, there's going to be a bit of math. Eventually, you will also study some stats, because a huge part of economics is about observing statistical facts and trying to explain them, like what I'm showing here with GDP. So be ready if you plan to do more economics in the future. But for this class, I will just maybe ask you to manipulate a couple of numbers. But literally, it will be just a simple division. Don't be too worried. To use those numbers, to manipulate those numbers, you will need to know the concepts that are associated to it. So as long as you know the concepts, you will be able to manipulate the corresponding numbers. Okay. Yes, I know Fourier. He's done a bunch of things. And in particular, yes, if you plan to do some finance, you will study his equations a lot. Some of his stuff, which is just pure math, is being used in finance in particular, and also in macroeconomic theory, I think. I mostly saw this guy in finance. Yeah, exactly. Fourier transforms is something you're going to see in finance. Okay, enough rambling about this, because I could go on all day. It's a fascinating topic to me. I'm pretty nerdy about that. Let's go over part 2 of the second unbundling. Usual disclaimer, some of this content is taken from another SFU professor, Nicolas Schmidt. I am entirely responsible for any error, and I do not legally allow this content to be published without my consent. So, what's new about the second unbundling? Let's make a review. I've been talking about this for 30 minutes now, but a review never hurts. So, the first unbundling was about one roof production, but it was about having consumption take place in another location. So the first unbundling was about disconnecting consumption from production. Stages of production were organized under one plant. Factories were in the north. So factories of the world were concentrated in pretty much Europe, United States, and Japan. There was trade in intermediate goods, capital, services, but it was actually mostly among G7 countries. They had the know-how, and they didn't know how to communicate this to countries where maybe wages would be lower. The second unbundling is about just production. It disconnects different stages of production. So it's not about one roof anymore. It's about multiple roofs, as we've seen with the production of iPhones, for instance. But this is the case for many other cases. Even something as like the production of shoes takes place in different countries. Insoles are made in one country, outsoles in another country, laces in another country or another firm, and then everything's assembled in another factory. Yes, everything is recorded. I do not use Zoom because Zoom has a shit quality. That's all. The quality, the software I'm using, just a side note, is called OBS, Open Broadcasting Software, and this is what this is free, and this is what most people use on Twitch. So if you follow any streamer on Twitch, in particular video game streamers, that's the same software they use. It's just that I'm using it in a very basic way. Just put my face on the slides, and that's it. Okay, sorry about this segue. I also love to learn about this. So the second unbundling started gradually in the 1970s, but it's mostly in the 1990s that we saw it happening. Some countries, which I believe are called the Asian tigers, we call them the Asian dragons in France, but I guess any badass animal will do. So which was Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, Singapore as well, started becoming the factories of the world. Those countries back then became the factories of the world for basic goods. I mentioned the example of my father's factory who closed because Adidas, Puma, and all those brands started getting their shoes produced in Southeast Asian countries. Gradually, those firms, however, started going up in the supply chain and started making more sophisticated products. And Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong now are making high-tech products mostly. So is China. China is making a bit of everything. Manufacturing is still under one roof, just the manufacturing, but not design, not marketing, not after sales, and so on. So now we have intra-factory flows of goods, ideas, know-how, and so on. Know-how is flowing from rich nations to developing nations. Oh yeah, I mentioned Apple before. Let's talk about them again. Why not, eh? So Apple used to produce in Texas. It was American labor, American technology, American management, American logistics, marketing, and so on. So back then, they probably had the label made in the US on their tags. Now, they are made in many nations, assembled in China, held by a Taiwanese management company, Foxconn. Although China and Taiwan, are not buddy-buddies these days, I think China doesn't mind having Taiwanese companies on their soil since it's also good for their business. Foxconn employs 1 million workers in China, among which we have 300,000 for Apple's iPhones. This data might be a bit outdated. As I talked about last lecture, I was mentioning the production of iPhone 4, something like that. What are we at? iPhone 15 or something? I don't know. But Foxconn is still working in China for Apple. What about Ireland? Oh yeah, 12. Okay, thank you. Maybe I got ahead of myself. Ireland, yes, recently became a good hub for high-tech companies in Europe due to their low corporate taxes. So other European countries were complaining about that, saying, hey, it's not fair. You're attracting all the companies because your corporate taxes are low. And Ireland said, yeah, suck it. We have the euro, so we have the same currency, but we don't need to have the same taxes. And this is one of the caveats of European companies, the European Union right now. They have a common policy on trade, so on tariffs, but not on taxes. So each country in the European Union can decide on its own taxes. So they still compete in taxes, although they have the same currency. You can think about this is very close to the American system. The United States have the same currency, the dollar, but in each state there are different state laws on taxes. For instance, if you check where most headquarters of big companies are located in the US, where do you think they are? Gonna make you guess on the chat, please. Where do you think most companies' headquarters are declared? Some of you might say, yes, okay, Delaware, right away. So Delaware, which is a tiny state on the East Coast, has Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and many other companies' headquarters because being located there, they are subject to corporate taxation or different corporate laws from Delaware. Delaware is very lenient with companies, which is why literally in Delaware you have like mailboxes, not even an office. You have a mailbox that says Facebook, and this is where Facebook gets its mail about corporate taxes and things like that. Not sure about Alabama, but definitely Delaware hosts Facebook, Microsoft, maybe Google, but nothing else is done there. Literally, they probably have a team of accountants there that take care of taxes, that find loopholes for those companies to pay less taxes. And everything else is, well, at least for high-tech companies, located in California. Oh, and now they might be leaving California for Texas. Okay. Joe Rogan too, yes, but let's not get into that. Okay, so one of the implications, and there are too many implications here, is about how competition among nations changed. The notion of comparative advantage has been denationalized. It's not about France having comparative advantage in the production of one good versus England versus another country. Now, it's more about what stages of productions firms are good at. And the second is it changed the nature of trade, which I already talked about, but doesn't hurt to repeat things a bit. So, in the first unbundling, exports are a bundle of national know-how, labor, capital, institutions. So all the inputs needed to produce a good are located in a single country. So this is why we can say France maybe has a comparative advantage in that, because French firms are making a certain good and have a low opportunity cost of making that good. Remember the notion of comparative advantage and opportunity cost? That will be very important for the exams and the next quizzes. In the second unbundling, exports are a mixture of several national comparative advantages. The high-tech of this country, some manufacturing process of that country, another manufacturing process of that country, some services provided by a firm from that country, like Foxconn, like Taiwanese management, and Chinese labor. So now a good is not just a good made in the US by US labor and by US inputs. It's a mixture of a bunch of different countries' inputs. So global value chains redraw international borders of comparative advantages. And so looking at Ricardo's model of comparative advantage is losing some relevance. Because remember, Ricardo was trying to explain why countries trade, why countries open their borders, why they lower the tariffs. But now it's not just about one country producing a good versus another country producing a good. It's about one country producing a part of a good that is going to be assembled or mixed with another part of a good produced in another country. Let's take the example of a Vietnamese parts exporter. A Vietnamese firm produced agricultural machinery and parts before 1998. So think about tractors, and I know the brands, but I don't know the actual names in English. I come from the countryside, so I know a couple of those tools in French, but not in English. Sorry. It had a good labor force, not necessarily good management. But after 1990s, Honda started sending engineers from Japan to provide production management, know-how, and technology transfers. So that helped Vietnam build a Japanese-like production model with Vietnamese wages, which were way lower than Japanese wages. The company got overseas order in motorcycle parts, 80% to Honda, but also Japanese motorcycle producers. Another example, Costa Rica. The population back then was equal to 3.5 million. I believe today it's 5.4 million. So in 1996, Intel invested $300 million to build a semiconductor and test plant. So that's a greenfield FDI because it's built from scratch in another country. Intel's gross sales, just the sales, were equal to 2 times Costa Rica's GDP. This is still common every now and then to have huge companies' sales or profits being equal to the GDP of some African countries. If you think about Benin or Burundi, these countries have a rather low GDP compared to the sales or profits made by Google, Facebook, and so on. So the government of Costa Rica identified a close fit with Intel because, of course, Costa Rica would benefit from this foreign direct investment, and demonstrated how the country's investment climate would adapt to meet the project's requirement against an impressive list of alternative locations. So they pretty much built a case to keep Intel, to keep them invest in Costa Rica. This is pretty much part of those bilateral investment treaties or those deep provisions. Except that here it's just about making sure Intel stays in Costa Rica. It's not really making a deal with the whole US government, but just with Intel. So Costa Rica worked hard to enhance the country's technical education, incentives law, regulation, infrastructures. So they pretty much created favorable conditions for Intel and for other investors as well. They knew that there would be a rapid way to develop, to create jobs, to favor growth, and so as a consequence, to increase government expenditures, and so on. In 1999, so 3 years after Intel invested, 60% of Costa Rica's GDP growth was attributed to Intel. Which, by the way, it's kind of risky. Relying on one single firm for growth is kind of risky, because if one day another country just rivals Costa Rica with maybe lower wages and good education, Intel might just say, oh, I'm going. And then Costa Rica might end up with a lot of unemployment and other things. But of course, Costa Rica's investments were not only targeting Intel, but rather other companies maybe in the same field. But increasing or improving education overall is never bad. So the combination of both improved investment climate, developed technology cluster, and secured other FDI projects in other targeted sectors, like the medical device industry, call centers, and there's probably many more. So by trying to improve in order for Intel to invest more in Costa Rica, they also improved overall. They also created incentives for other firms to invest in Costa Rica, hence reducing the risk of reducing the risk associated to Intel leaving Costa Rica. The Intel investment also reached far into the community, affecting education, the country's knowledge base, workplace standards, and business culture. Education in Costa Rica these days is as good as in any North American country. I know, I actually recently met a Costa Rican person who works for Ernst & Young, one of the top 4 consulting companies in the world. She gets contract from very, very big companies, and she works for the Costa Rican office, but she is as competent as anybody else working for Ernst & Young in Canada or in the US office or any American office. And her education is from Costa Rica. Costa Rica's growth rate was 4.5 on average between 2000 and 2016. Something that France would dream about, against 3.8% for other countries in the region. Investments foster growth, growth fosters development, and development fosters investments further. So you can create a virtuous cycle with an initial investment if this initial investment is consequent enough, and if the appropriate policies are adopted as a consequence. Honda's and Intel's examples, or their global value chain, reached into the country and turned Vietnam and Costa Rica's comparative advantages into a denationalized blend of traits. Things were produced in Vietnam and in Costa Rica, but not with only Vietnamese and Costa Rican inputs. There was Japanese management, know-how, and Vietnamese labor that made Honda competitive. It was American management and technology plus the Costa Rica location and labor that made Intel competitive. So globalization is not about exploiting the comparative advantage you already have, but is about changing them. And once you introduce some dynamic aspect to comparative advantage, the whole Ricardo theory about, oh yeah, France should produce cheese and whoever else should produce something else, breaks down. Because this is what we call a static model. That works if things are as they are and if they stay as they are. But if after trade there are maybe more investments in other countries, then the balance of comparative advantages is going to change. And so a country as a whole, maybe France, will not have a comparative advantage in making cheese anymore. It might be better to just tell a country where wages are lower how to make the same cheese. But with workers that you have to pay less than French workers, you can produce the same cheese, exactly the same, at a lower price. But then the cheese is not made in France, it's made in that other country. So the principle of comparative advantage explains why nations trade. Nothing changes with the second unbundling. Countries still have strong reasons to trade, for the same reasons as what I mentioned in the first and second lectures. The gains from trade can be an increase in consumption due to specialization, increase in productivity, learning by doing, increase in demand fosters economies of scale, which decreases cost of production, which decreases the prices. And the second was a greater variety of goods is now available. Who can complain about now being able to eat mangoes in Canada now that they can be imported from Mexico or Hawaii? Absolutely right. In the chat, somebody mentions that it's inevitable that knowledge will spread. Absolutely. I will talk about this probably in the next lecture. But the production of knowledge creates good externalities. It creates good effects. Just you having a degree is going to improve the life of people around you, because people around you are going to benefit from your knowledge. Those people did not necessarily pay for your education, your brother, your cousin. Maybe your parents did pay for your education, but not your cousins, not your grandparents. Yet, they might benefit from your knowledge. And so, this is something that should be encouraged, because it will improve everybody's lives. Just you having some knowledge will improve people around you's lives. So, education, or at least the consumption or creation of knowledge, should be incentivized one way or another. Oh, the idea that trade is denationalized is just that it's not one country trading with another now, in terms of one country producing this good, trading with another country producing that good. Now, it's more about, it could be a French company is producing a certain good, but this good is made of Vietnamese labor, French knowledge, Taiwanese management, and so on. It's just that a good is not attached to a country anymore. That's what we mean by that. The reasons for trade are the same. Trading is more efficient, yes, because companies can benefit from lower costs. Now that they can communicate the way to make the goods to countries where wages are lower, in particular, I talk about labor here, then those countries can produce exactly the same goods as before, but because they can pay workers for a lower price, for a lower wage, they can cut their costs dramatically. They can reduce the price of the goods dramatically. They get more competitive, which is also good for us. I hear many French people talk about, this clothes is bad quality, it's probably made in China. They say that. And then I tell them, whether it's made in China, Bangladesh, or France, doesn't matter. China can make high quality t-shirts too. It's not that China is bad at making t-shirts and France is good at it. It's that French brands just ask China to produce a certain quality. That's all. And for this quality, China says we can produce this cloth at this quality for this price, which is always lower than making it, having it made in France. So those people have it wrong when they say, oh, it's bad quality because it's made in China. No, it's bad quality because the firms are asking whatever company abroad to produce at this quality. And then I tell them they could produce at the same quality with a French company. It would be more expensive, and instead of buying your t-shirts $10, you would buy it $20 or $30. Why do you complain? In general, they don't really know what to say. It's just that they're not aware of how things are working. A good quality product can be made anywhere in the world. The know-how can flow through countries without any cost now. Firms decide to produce a high quality product or not, depending on the cost of producing those goods. The principle of comparative advantage also explains who gains from trade. That's what Ricardo was talking about in his theory. What do changes in one nation's competitiveness mean for other nations? Who makes and exports what? So let's talk about who gains from trade. So Ricardo's all nations win result was based on fundamental logic associated with the first unbundling. You have a comparative advantage, I have one as well. Let's specialize in our respective goods and let's trade with each other because we get more efficient. We can sell to each other at a lower price. Our consumers can consume more of the same good, and also new different goods. There's a sports analogy here. Think about two hockey clubs. We discuss an exchange of players. The exchange will be based on what each team needs and what they don't need. So, they might exchange players of a type they have too many of. I only need one or two guys to score the goal. I don't know how I don't know what it's called in hockey. I like hockey, but I just don't know the terms. And they might say, oh, I only need one or two guys in offense, and I have three right now. I can exchange this guy for a guy in defense, which I am lacking of. For instance, that would be comparative advantage. That's first unbundling. Now, what's going on with the second unbundling? Well, on weekends, the coach of the better team goes and trains player of the worst team. Literally, he transfers his know-how to the competitor. The outcome is that, well, the worst team is going to get better. So that's the worst team is going to get more competitive. That raises competition in the league, which we are happy about as consumers, right? As spectators. We want to see more competition. We want to see more records being broken. But the better team, who is allowing the coach to spread his know-how to other teams, is not going to is not clear whether this team is going to win. This team might lose its edge. This team, which is the better team, might have a secret. Maybe the coach has a secret that makes this team more successful than the other teams. If you allow this guy to spread his knowledge to other teams, those other teams are going to catch up and they might rival with the better team. The coach is pretty happy. He's just spreading his knowledge and he's getting paid for it. That's pretty much what consulting work is. As a consultant, you could work for two different companies which are competitors to each other, but you just give them your know-how. And you're paid, of course, to give them your know-how. Yeah, we can talk about the French Ligue 1 soccer for a bit. It's mostly due to investments. The PSG has a lot of money, thanks to people from Qatar, and they can afford just the best players, which is hard for all the other clubs in France. Yes. But I'm not a big soccer fan in general, so I won't get into that. So the takeaway is that if technology flows make foreign nations better at producing goods than the G7 countries used to export, the change may harm G7 nations. And again, I'll mention this again, but the extreme right political parties in Western countries then say, those countries are stealing our jobs. We need to keep our companies in our countries and so on. So gains from trade do not automatically hold when the sources of comparative advantage cross borders as well as goods. The example of the coach. Note that we as consumers are still gaining from it. Because instead of me having to buy a French t-shirt for 30 euros, I can buy a t-shirt of the same brand made in China for 10 euros, same quality. Am I not happier from that? Yeah. Then there are cross-country competitiveness issues. Offshoring improves the competitiveness of the northern firm doing it. If Toyota offshores but Fiat, yeah, the Italian company that makes cars, does not, then Toyota is going to get an edge. They can produce car parts at a lower price, so they can lower the price of their cars, and the quality of the cars is still as good as some cars that Fiat makes. So, the denationalization of comparative advantage for nations participating in the global value chain can shift the comparative advantage of third nations. By Toyota offshoring to other countries, Italy, if Italy doesn't offshore, might lose its comparative advantage in the production of cars. And also, Fiat will have a very, very strong incentive to follow suit. It will have an incentive to imitate Toyota's production process. Fiat will look for a country where its cars' parts can be produced at a lower price to be able to get more competitive. It is similar for developing nations. China produces electric motors with the US know-how and the low Chinese wages. Brazil and South Africa have a hard time to compete with the same know-how, but the low wages from China. So, of course, high tech and low wages is going to beat low tech and low wages. So, China participating in the global value chain will harm industrial comparative advantage of developing nations which are not involved in global value chains. So they better get on board with the global value chain boat, otherwise they will be left off. And that's how we see countries like China and India growing at a very fast rate, whereas other countries in Southeast Asia do not develop at such a fast pace. So the outcome is that most countries want to participate in global value chains. It pushes countries to implement policies facilitating their participation. Hence, the increase in bilateral investment treaties, deep provisions, and regional trade agreements. Then the third part of what comparative advantage theory can explain is who makes and exports what. A country's exports now depends on its position in the global value chain rather than underlying comparative advantage, as with the first unbundling. Indeed, Renault and Nissan, I don't know exactly what the relationship between Renault and Nissan is, but I know that they have a partnership on a bunch of cars. Renault is the first or second biggest car company in France. Oh, 50% stake. There you go. Thank you. So it looks like China is exporting iPhones because they are assembled there, but mostly what they're exporting is the assembly part. All the other parts are produced in different countries in the world. Remember, some of them are produced in France. I believe the geolocalization system is produced in France and Switzerland. Some of the chips are made by Samsung, the screens by LG. Some chips are made in the US. I believe it was in Oregon, and so on. So just looking at trade flows can be misleading because what we see in the data is iPhones are coming from China. Yes, but they're not made in China. They're just assembled. So you need to look deeper into the production process of a good. And then you see, oh, China is only the assembly part. The rest comes from other countries. So you need to break down the production process if you want to see who exports what. And looking at the trade deficit between the US and China does not mean much with global value chains because of this fractionalized production process. The second implication was that the nature of trade changed. '21st century trade is more complex. It's not just about, oh, this is made in France, this goes to Italy. And oh, this is made in Italy, it goes to France. Now you have to look at parts. So you have to look at all the different parts that go into the production of a good, which are traded in the process. So we have international movement of production facilities, greenfield, brownfield, foreign direct investments, personnel, so pretty much some labor force. Some engineers, some American engineers might have to go to China to explain their know-how, to train the workers there to produce the good they want to produce. And then, of course, the transfer of know-how, of knowledge. And there's also an intertwining of the services necessary to coordinate the dispersed production. So all the communication means, all the coordination means, such as the internet, telecoms, express parcel delivery, so everything you need to ship parts as well, trade-related finance, and so on. If you have a question, can you please use the chat? That would be easier because I have a hard time actually hearing questions with this computer. Don't forget that before the first unbundling, this was already happening in the North. The North was already communicating with the North. It's after the second unbundling that the South started taking part in this process. And now things are more difficult to measure because we have tangible assets such as goods. So you can count goods in an air cargo. But then you have all those things such as know-how, capital, intellectual properties, and so on, which are crossing borders, which are way harder to quantify. There is an asymmetry in the change because between the North and the North, the second unbundling did not change much. We already had that before the second unbundling. Now that the South is taking part in the process, this is where things change. The relationship between the North and the South is what's going to change with the second unbundling. So these new flows are a revolution for the South, for developing nation exporters, whereas they're just an evolution for developed countries. Developed countries were already making computers, shoes, and whatnots. Now they can make them for cheaper. So it's a new way to cut on the costs. For the South was buying those things before, and maybe not a lot of it because they were still developing. Now the other ones making them. So this is a huge shift in the way developing nations should conduct trade policy and all the consequences of it. Investments in education, investments in infrastructure, changing the laws regarding trade policy, anti-competitiveness, intellectual property, making investments easier to flow, and so on. Okay, let me go through the question in the chat. So when we think about trade and how nations benefit from trade, when we look at countries with lower value in human capital and developing nations which have production from G7 nations being outsourced to them, how are they benefiting from this transaction? I understand that they are receiving jobs that could potentially increase GDP and overall human welfare. However, does that not subject them to the accepting whatever industry is in their country at the moment, such as Intel in Costa Rica? Well, you're right in the sense that some developing countries might be subject to the holder problem. The holder problem says that once one firm invests in that country, then the country is kind of stuck. It's like, oh, if you want to develop, you gotta keep me in, gotta be nice to me. But that's if the country makes some kind of exclusivity agreement with that firm. If the country, one way or another, is tied to the investments made by this firm. What I mentioned before is that just having some investments coming in is going to increase wages because there is an increase for labor demand. They need workers. So that will increase labor demand. That will increase definitely GDP through, well, all this new demand. All these new workers have now an income that is going to increase. So consumption is going to increase. The government can make investments thanks to the tax revenue. And so development can start. And development can be done in many different ways. But in particular, it can be done in the health system. You increase health, like you invest in medical facilities. You train more doctors, or you make them come from abroad to improve people's lives, people's health. You can invest in education. You make your population overall better educated. By doing this, they can also get more productive, which is more interesting for those firms coming from abroad. So if it's only about being exploited by foreign firms, let's say you are some sort of a dictatorship. The country is a dictator, they just want to keep the money for themselves. So what they do is they tell the country, yes, come here, produce, and I will not reinvest this money into my people, into my government, into my economy. So people will kind of be stuck in this situation where they will just be doing factory work. But with this increase in income can come many investments and in education, among other things, and so the country can develop. Once the country develops, the country can also change its comparative advantage. If at the beginning the country had low, just a lot of labor force, not very skilled, but low wage, that's how they started, then they can start training the labor force. And then they say, hey, our guys, it's not that our guys didn't finish high school. Now they have finished high school. They know a bit more. Now they go to university. Now they are able to do, they are able to operate at different stages of the production process, not only factory work. This is what the Asian dragons did in the 70s. When manufacturing started to be done in those countries, like basic goods like shoes and things like that, those countries then invested in education, health, and so on, in infrastructure, so that now Korea, Taiwan, Singapore or producing super high-tech stuff. They are also part of the biggest technological innovations in the world. That started with producing shoes in factories and getting paid $1 an hour or something like that. Now, their standards of living are as high as North American countries or Western countries. I hope that answers your question. But you're right, that if your ties with a given firm are too strong and you don't maybe diversify your risk, diversify your portfolio of firms investing in your country, you might be subject to the holder problem, which is pretty much, a firm has so much bargaining power over that government that they can do pretty much whatever they want with the government. You have to be very careful about that for sure. So, why asymmetric? Well, because the knowledge-labor ratio was way higher in the north than it was in the south. Knowledge divided by labor. So, the change was way bigger for developing countries that had a low knowledge-labor ratio before. They had a lot of labor for a low knowledge. Now that low knowledge comes, they are increasing their knowledge to labor ratio, which is going to provoke a dramatic change in their wages and so on. The ability to coordinate internationally was a revolutionary boost in developing nations' ability to export parts, but only mild stimulus for G7 parts exporter. Those guys just got more competitive. Just. So it's an asymmetric trade opening. And this is the same way we see that tariffs did not decrease much in the north after the 90s because they were low already. It's in the south that they decreased to facilitate all of these investments and to facilitate trade. And now there's also more connections between countries. So now we have developing countries exporting parts to G7 nations and also to each other. NIE is what we call the newly industrialized economies. And the Asian four are Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. In 1990s, we had pretty much one directional flows of parts and components. Whereas in 1998, we have parts of all sorts going back and forth from one country to another, produced in one country, assembled in another, pretty much. Don't mind the numbers. Those, I believe, represents some percentages of parts going from one country to another. Just pay attention to the arrows, which are now, in a way, higher number. So a couple of facts about this asymmetric opening thing. I will go over them quickly because I want to cover everything before the midterm exam. So we can look at auto parts exports in the R10. China, Korea, India, Poland, Indonesia, Thailand, Ireland, Malaysia, Singapore, and Turkey. Versus part of the G7 countries, US, Germany, and Japan. Pretty much the biggest manufacturing exporters in Western countries. Those shares are way higher. Those changes are way higher between 1988, right before 1990, so right before the second unbundling, and 1998, where the second unbundling is currently happening and has started already, so over 10 years. You can see that the change is higher for parts than it is for actual vehicles. And that's also a result of this fractionalized process. Parts are made in those R10 countries, but not the whole cars. Second implication are changes at the product level. In particular, we're going to see an interesting statistical fact happen called the smile curve, and also, the smile curve will come the servicification of manufacturing. Try to say this one 3 times in a row. Good luck. So, look at this beautiful phone. I wish I could have one of these phones these days, but I need the internet. I need WhatsApp. Unfortunately, I live in another country. I need to get in touch with my family one way or another. If I didn't have to, I pretty much would have this phone. So, this phone is composed of three different sectors go into the production of this phone. The primary sector is raw material, copper, rare earth, petroleum, and any other mineral material needed to make the components. Then those components go into the manufacturing process, pressing, welding, assembling, getting the plastic done, and so on. Finally, there is the design. So why does it look this way? Gray, with the logo there, with the camera there, and so on. The software part, the operating system for smartphones. The retail part, the marketing, a lot of advertising goes into that. They did not advertise a lot back then about how indestructible those phones were, but they should have. Everybody knows though that it's pretty hard to break them, and how long the battery lasts. I remember having one of these phones, 3410 it was. Not 3310 that everybody knows, but I think I had 3410, and the battery would last something like a week and a half, literally. Turning it off at night, sure, but still, the battery would last a long time. I miss this a lot. And the value added that goes into the production of a Nokia N95, which is not a mask, has changed a lot. You can see that the green part here is mostly services. Camera, assembly, other parts are pretty much the primary sector. Integrated circuits, camera are pretty much assembly sectors, so manufacturing sector. And licenses, distribution, retailing, and other pre and post fabrication services are the third sector. And you can see that the value added of a Nokia N95 is mainly made of services, a bit of raw materials, and a bit of the manufacturing. More than half now is coming from services. So the idea is that with the second unbundling, the share of value added that goes of each sector that goes into the production of a good changed. Before 1990, so in the 70s and 1980s, the share of each sector was roughly equal. Fabrication was actually a bit lower because the manufacturing was already standardized. So knowing exactly how to do it was rather cheap. We had machines, we had conveyor belts, we had factory workers to take care of that. There was a bit more value added going into post-fabrication services, marketing, distribution, retailing, and so on. And a bit more in pre-fabrication services, such as the design of the product, and so on. This graph applies to many products, not just a phone. And so the idea is that after 1990s, with a reduction in the cost of manufacturing, in particular coming from exploiting cheap labor abroad, the share of value added between each sector changed dramatically. The actual manufacturing process, the fabrication, decreased a lot, while the pre and post fabrication services increased a lot. We also saw an increase in advertising. Advertising is part of the post fabrication services, after sale services, and a lot of investments into the design of the good in order for firms to distinguish themselves from their competitors. So this is what we call servicification of manufacturing. The overall production of a good got servicified because the share that goes in sheer production, in pretty much factory work, decreased, the share of value added, whereas the share of value added that goes into services increased. And you can see we have a cute smile here. And by extension, we also observe this phenomenon overall in the three different sectors of production. Primary is raw materials. Manufacturing is pure industry, pure factory work. And services represent everything else. Between 1985 and 2005, services have more than doubled. Manufacturing has decreased a bit, and primary has decreased quite a lot. And we observe a big increase in services share over 20 years in many countries. So those are changes. So when you see here minus 10%, this means that the share of value added that is due to manufacturing decreased by 10% between 1995 and 2005. You can look at it by industry, transport equipment, machinery, chemical products, and also by nation. Pretty much the same trend is observed. It seems that in particular the Philippines, not so much. It's not as deep. For metal products and chemical products, that could be due to just a specialization of that country over the years. All of the other ones have this dip in manufacturing, increase in service, and increase in primary. That's a result of the commoditization, that's a hard one to say as well, and the standardization of fabrication. So as mentioned before, why do we observe that? It comes from the fact that more services are embedded in the good itself. More design, more technology, more software, more advertising, more marketing overall, more maybe customer service, and so on. This even applies to something as that seems simple, but it's not so simple anymore, as shoes. Even I myself, as a skateboarder, I have seen the evolution of the technology they use to make skateboarding shoes over 15 years. I've been skating for, 16 years now. I'm old. Back then, we would just buy, all the shoes were pretty much the same. The logo or the brand would change, but the technology would be the same. The quality of the shoes would overall be the same. Some brands showed up with, we have a new type of suede, which is thin, but at the same time harder to, more durable. So the shoe lasts longer, but at the same time is not as bulky around your foot. So when you skateboard, you have a way better feeling of your skateboard, and you can do your tricks way more easily. And I can tell the difference, definitely. I'm not that good, but a lot of anybody with a minimum amount of knowledge in skateboarding can feel the difference. Running shoes. There is such a discrepancy, a variation in prices for, yes, I can do a kickflip. There is a lot of difference in the prices of shoes. You can have basic running shoes for $30 at Skechers, but you can also buy fancy ASICS shoes for $120, which adapt to all kinds of terrains, which have a specific cushion on the heel, which have a specific foot or specific shape, to increase the feel, but at the same time decrease the impact on your knees, and so on. If you type my name on YouTube, you might find some skateboarding videos. Not a lot, but you might. Keep it a secret though. So, the commoditization of fabrication is a result of high tech plus low wages, which radically reduce the cost of fabrication, the factory part, but not the service inputs. You still need engineers or people who are very smart and educated to design a new product, like a new iPhone. The manufacturing in itself doesn't cost much. It's all about the marketing, you know, those TED Talk type things that what's his name, Steve Jobs used to give, all this advertising, and so on. Not sponsored. My best friend is though. So if you look at these videos on YouTube, you will find footage of my friend mostly, which is sponsored, and he's done some international competitions for Red Bull and other things like that. But again, I don't want to get carried away with that. We can talk about this in office hours if you want. I gotta finish the lecture. The third implication is composed of three changes. First of all, labor market hollowing, rising equity premiums, and a final resolution of the globalization impact. So the first one, the labor market hollowing, can be summarized by this picture. We discovered life on Mars, so it's a new market. The bad news is they can work for cheaper. So all of you guys are going to lose your job. That's the idea. Great for people who don't work in this industry. So great for consumers, and because we can benefit from lower prices, but not for people who work in that industry. So the knowledge flows from the north to the south, but since labor is cheaper there, well, some people are going to lose their jobs in the northern country. Like my dad had to close the shoe factory and had to lay off 70 employees because he was not getting any contracts anymore from any firm. And all these people, which every now and then I meet, and sometimes they tell me, oh, I used to work for your dad back then. They have found another job. And of course, it was in a different type of industry. Let's go through a quick example, which is pretty much what I've talked about before. Imagine you have three productive factors. The high skill factor, so, you know, people with a PhD, engineers. Medium skill, people with a bachelor. And low skill, people with a high school degree. There are three types of goods, and each of them requires one factor in particular. One good needs engineers and PhDs in particular, because they need the knowledge. One of the good needs just bachelor degrees workers. And the third good just needs basic work, like basic factory work. So no need for high skilled workers for that. There is know-how in all sectors. And we have two nations, the North and the South. The North has a lot of high skill and medium skill. The South, and scarce in low skill. The South has the low skill, but doesn't have the high and medium skill workers. The know-how in the North is better in all three sectors. So, under the first unbundling, the North, since the North has a lot of high and medium skilled workers, they have a comparative advantage in the production of good 1 and 2. So they export good 1 and 2, but they're going to import good 3 from the South, which has a comparative advantage in the production of that good due to an abundance in low-skilled workers. Okay, that's Ricardo's model. Instead of 2 goods, now we have 3. So in the North, high-skilled and medium-skilled workers are going to win because the North specializes in the production of the good in which they are in high demand. But in the north, nobody needs low-skilled workers because because the production of the goods who need low-skilled workers happens in the south. In the second unbundling, now, the north medium-skilled sector know-how goes to the south. As a result, good 2 is now exported by the south, so the arrow here is reversed. Medium-skilled workers are now going to suffer in the north and are going to benefit in the south. That could be due to lower wages in the south, but a free movement of know-how. Good 1 is still exported by the north because the north has the high-skilled workers needed to produce the good. And good 3 has the low-skilled workers needed to produce good 3. So nothing changes for good 1 and good 3. So obviously, medium-skilled workers in the north are losing, and medium-skilled workers in the south are winning. Are there any other winners and losers? That's less clear, because the transfer of know-how to the south may also affect them in various degrees. And if you think about the dynamic aspect where the south could invest in education and now increase the amount of medium and high-skilled workers they have, while not being paid as much as in the north, then firms in the north might say, hey, those guys are as qualified as you, but I can pay them for cheaper. So I'm going to get the goods produced there. And you can look at the share of employment by skill level in Western countries, in G7 countries. In high skills, it has increased. In low skills, it has increased a bit, but it has mostly decreased in mid skill level. Let's go over GDP quickly again. That's going to be needed for the midterm. So, remember the GDP is a measure of the market value of all final goods and services produced in a period of time. There are several ways to measure it. The expenditure approach consists in aggregating what's consumed, what's invested, and what's purchased by the government, plus what is being sold abroad, minus goods coming from abroad. GDP is for domestic, so it's everything that happens on the territory. The second approach, which is equivalent in terms of numbers, but comes from another source, comes from production. This is the one I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, which is the sum across all industries of their value added, where value added is equal to the value of the output minus the value of intermediate consumption. Okay? Those formulas you need to know, at least you need to be able to use them. Okay? Especially GDP. And the income approach corresponds to adding incomes that firms pay households for factors of production they hire. So, wages for workers, interest paid to the bank, and profits for entrepreneurs, for firms. Those three approaches give you exactly the same number at the end of the day. If you're taking a 105, or if you've taken 105 before, you might have learned about how to compute GDP. And this is what we use when we talk about economic growth of a country. So in principle, those three methods provide the same answer. So gross domestic product is equal to gross national income. There can be errors of measurements here and there, so there are some discrepancies. Not a big deal. They are usually fairly small. You can look at them online if you want to. And in general, labor earns about 60% of national income. That's fairly constant, has been constant over the years, and it's constant across countries. Over the last 20 years, it has decreased a bit below 60%, and the share of profits has increased a bit over time. It used to be in the 20% range, and now it's closer to 30. The know-how from the north gets to be applied in both north and south. As we mentioned, knowledge spreads everywhere. Knowledge knows no boundaries. So the know-how gains in value, which means that the gap between the return to capital and the safe real rate of return is going to increase. Investing in capital, whether it's human or physical, although it can be risky, is also going to have higher yields than a safe real rate of return that you can find by just buying a government bond. Capital to knowledge gains also contribute to increasing income inequalities within G7 type countries. Decreases the share of national income going to labor because there is an increase in capital. But that's not a big deal. The idea is that knowledge is now more valued because it spreads everywhere. And part of this knowledge can come from investments in human capital that makes our workers more efficient. So workers can also benefit from knowledge-based capital. Being able to use a better software, although there was an investment in capital, in computers, if the workers are able to use this new software better, they will also have an increase in their own productivity, which ultimately will increase their wage one way or another. I will quickly go over this because it's not really important. But I want to talk about the increased income inequalities. So we learned that in principle, GDP is the same as national income. Okay, that's just what I explained in the GDP slide. The fact that the labor share falls will be linked to increased income inequalities. There is a push to develop tools to measure GDP per income groups to better address inequality issues. So you want to distinguish income inequalities across groups. You want to look at do poor people get poorer or richer people get richer, for instance. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, but both mean an increase in inequalities. So just looking at an increase in inequalities is not enough to say whether it's because the rich get richer or the poor gets poorer. We can look at the bottom 50% national income share. So this corresponds to the 50% poorest people in the US. And you look at the share of the national income they have over time. The 50% poorest people got a decreasing share of national income, both pre and post tax over time. So that means that this bottom 50% got poorer over time. On the other hand, the top 10%, so the 10% richest people in the US, had a dip in their share of national income here from the 50s to the 80s to the 90s, and then it increased again. So over time, at some point, the rich got poorer. They're already rich, but eventually they went back to the rich are getting richer, and this is still something we observe today. Here we have an overall decrease, but here we have a decrease then an increase. That's due to the emergence here of a middle class, which is between the bottom 50% and the top 10. And finally, globalization, the impact of globalization has a finer resolution. Instead of going from firm to firm, so one good versus another, or one country versus another, now it's one production stage versus another. Same as what I mentioned before. Let me finish with those 4 different impacts, which you will need to know for the midterm and the quiz, due to the second unbundling as opposed to the first unbundling. So bear with me, I will take five more minutes. I really apologize about that. I talk too much, I think. So the first one is that the second unbundling is more individual. Its impact is more individual than the first unbundling. The idea of the first unbundling impact was that it happened sector by sector. So governments could predict what sunrise sectors were and what sunset sectors were. A sunrise sector is a sector that is going to improve as the sun rises. So the sun is going to shine on those sectors. Whereas a sunset sector is a dying sector. So they could see it coming. Looking at their comparative advantage, they could see, oh, this sector soon is going to lose its comparative advantage against another sector. So people in those firms, in those industries are going to lose their jobs and so on. Governments could see it coming and maybe also facilitate the transition towards a sunrise sector. Governments these days, at least in northern countries, in western countries, sometimes propose transition programs for workers who are laid off from one industry and need to find another job. And they say, oh, you have skills which are not exactly the same as that other industry, but close enough. We can facilitate the transition by proposing fast-paced, like accelerated training programs. So labor, capital, technology, all the inputs working in a sector were in the same boat. If the sector goes down, that labor will not be in demand anymore. That precise capital, that technology won't be in demand anymore. With the second unbundling, it's not necessarily the case. Because now we are talking about stage by stage or job by job. If you need a specific skill to make a specific part of a good, but maybe the good is not produced in that same country, so only the design is done in that country, you just need the skilled workers. You don't need maybe the factory, you don't need the factory facility, the production facilities. So the impact now is more individuals because of this fractionalized production process. So it breaks up the national team of technology and labor. Now, in France, the technology could still be in demand, but not the labor anymore. So one part of the economy could be in demand and not the other. So it's also harder for governments to conduct macroeconomic policies because they're going to be winners and losers now, not overall winners or not overall losers. The second is that the second unbundling is more sudden. The first unbundling required firms and nations to build most of the supply chain. If they specialize in the production of a good, then they have to build the whole supply chain. Remember, with the first unbundling, production was happening under one roof. With the second unbundling, you might need to be good only for one stage of the production process, and you might even get the know-how from abroad. So it might be easier to quickly build what you need to build in order to fulfill that task. So we can talk about a powdered industry. Just add labor and stir. The know-how is coming from abroad. Just need to get the minimum amount of facilities to execute that specific task. So things can change pretty fast. Here's an example. I'm going to skip it. You can just take a look at it just to see how fast things are going. It's just about the adaptation of Mexico to an investment by an American firm, I believe. The third aspect of the second unbundling is that now it's more unpredictable. The first unbundling, globalization, was predictable in the sense that if you see one sector go down, you can predict that the next sector is going to be a sector close enough to the one that just went down. Or on the other hand, if one sector is in demand or is rising, you can expect related sectors to also be rising, maybe in the near future. With the second unbundling, things are way more unpredictable because of the complex interaction of factors used. For example, you might need low-skilled labor in one industry, and suddenly that low-skilled labor might be needed in a very, very different industry that you might not expect to be related to. So it is increasingly more difficult to know what will get offshore next, which make it even harder for governments to build economic policy. Governments try to organize long-term economic policies. With the future being more unpredictable, it is increasingly hard. They might be afraid that a policy helping their industries now or in the next 3 years might harm other industries in the next 5 years. Finally, I can talk about the Uniqlo example. Sure. So, yeah, very quickly. Uniqlo is a company, you probably know it, is a company that makes low-end clothing. It's a Japanese firm. And now it is Asia's largest clothing company. It's not that Japan was very good at manufacturing. Rather, it is about the services that were put into the design and the production of Uniqlo items. The design and all those things actually happen in, wasn't it New York? Yeah. Uniqlo produces nothing directly. High quality and low cost by directly negotiating bulk purchases from manufacturers in China. And they have technical specialists. They also have a marketing team, I believe, which is located in New York, to also take care of the whole advertising and retailing and the distribution aspect of Uniqlo. Lululemon, I wish I had more time to talk about it. That's too bad. But same, those guys do not produce any of what they sell. They have 35 manufacturers who make their products. Most of them are in Asia. Only 3% are in North America. They own 4 distribution centers. There's one in Delta, British Columbia. So essentially what they do is they sell services. They sell the design, the production process, the fabric, the material and everything. And then they just pretty much ask firms to produce exactly what they need them to produce. But they're not the ones manufacturing. Nike is doing the same thing. And big clothing companies are doing the same thing. Especially the ones who are trying to sell high-end products. Most of their business comes from the design of the clothes, the design of the products, and the advertising and the marketing. Then they just say, okay, can you produce this with this fabric, with this cut, with those measurements? another company says, yeah, I can do that for this cost. Okay, boom, done. And finally, the second unbundling is more uncontrollable. That's also kind of a consequence of being more sudden, more unpredictable, and I guess more individual. The first unbundling would go as fast as technical advances would go. Innovations in transportation, pretty much. We talked about the evolution of railroad density over the years, the increase in air cargo. We talked about the development of the containers and standardized container size so that they can ship way faster and they can travel through the world way faster. Coordination issues were solved this way. So it would only go as fast as those innovations would go, and that would require, in particular, huge investments in infrastructure. There was also trade liberalization, which, as we saw, got rather slow at the beginning because it was due to governments leading those policies. This accelerated, of course, over after World War II with the GATT and WTO. You're right. Somebody in the chat says that the manufacturing company could make something similar to what Lulu does. Well, there might be some intellectual property or there might be some property rights on the production process. I don't know if Lululemon has a patent on the way they produce their yoga pants, but chances are they do. So chances are they are protecting the exact production process so that their manufacturers can only produce them because they're allowed to by Lululemon. This is my guess. It could be that just some companies are just specialized in manufacturing. They might just not decide to get into this whole business of making a separate brand or a competitive brand and so on. But you can definitely find things that look like knockoffs in other countries. They look exactly like Lululemon. They might not be called Lululemon. This fabric might be very, very similar, although it's not exactly a Lululemon pair of yoga pants, but it's cheaper. So why wouldn't a factory that makes Lululemon things make its own clothing brand similar to Lulu? I think there are many different reasons. I cannot tell exactly why they wouldn't, but maybe these firms are just specialized in manufacturing and they might get contract from other firms as well. Lululemon is probably not their only contractor. Okay, I went overboard. Let's see how fast I can go. I'll try to finish at least those notes. So, the second unbundling is more uncontrollable because of its pace. Before, with the first unbundling, the pace was led by investment in infrastructure and countries agreeing to lower their tariffs. With the second unbundling, the pace is determined by technological advances in ICT. And we've seen that with Moore's law, Metcalfe's law, and so on. We saw that those innovations go so fast that it's very hard for a government to keep up with. Whereas in the past, when it was just about investing in railroad densities, those investments would be pushed by governments. So they would control the pace of the first unbundling. The second unbundling space being determined by advances in ICT is just about the private sector making better processors, making 5G and so on. The government cannot keep track of that due to the exponential nature of those innovations, the exponential nature of the advances, of the speed in those innovations. Here's an example. I'm just going to finish with this. I have 1 minute. This is my last slide. Again, sorry about going over time. So, in Canada, the automobile sector has shifted parts of its production to Mexico, thanks to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Although the automobile sector in Canada is its most important manufacturing sector, it is losing its relative importance. Without the second unbundling, that change would not have happened that fast. Simply because, well, most people in Canada suck at Spanish. I can speak Spanish, but most people in Canada can't. Before the second unbundling, before the decrease in communication costs, immigration was not that high either. Not many people would migrate to other countries. And then it was way harder for a Canadian firm to transfer its know-how to a Mexican company and control all of the production process. Now that communication is made easier and more international, then definitely the Mexican factories could just adapt way faster. And this statistic, this decrease in the automobile sector in Canada went faster. That's it for this lecture. Again, sorry for going over time. Have a good rest of your week and see you in the next one. Bye.